Hello and welcome to this Girl Development meeting for February 10th. So today we'll be going over CSS priority, and then that will wrap up our CSS unit. And so we'll have a CSS review right after that. And then we'll also look at HTML buttons. All right, so for CSS priority, there's cascading priority. This basically says that the code follows the most specific selector that applies to it, which is not necessarily the selector that comes first. And so your browser also assigns priority based on the specificity of the selection. More specific selectors have higher priority. So if we look at this, the most selective selector is .main.sale.clearance_p. And so it'll execute the code in that selector first, and then it'll go to the other lesser selective selectors. So again, for cascading priority, selectors that have the same criteria follow the last selector written that applies. And so the tiebreaker is the position of the code, and the rules lower in the file overwrite rules higher in the file. So for this one, we have A as the selector 3 times in a row. And so the code that will execute is the last one, which says that the background color is black. So even though there is code for background color being yellow and teal, ultimately the background color will be black because that's the last selector that applies. All right, so that officially wraps up our CSS unit. So now we'll be diving into some review questions from CSS Review. All right, first off, CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. I think this was in our first meeting when we first went over what CSS is. And it's just something to know. What is the word outside of the curly brackets called? This is called a selector. We kind of briefly went over that just now with CSS priority. But basically it tells the computer exactly what elements you're referring to. All right, a declaration code inside of a selector is made up of a property and value. So this can be, for example, background color and let's say teal. And all the code in CSS is kind of structured as in property and value, which is really easy to remember. And it's also pretty intuitive to code as well. All right, in CSS, a blank separates property and value, and each line of code ends with a blank. All right, and so a colon separates property and value, and each line of code ends with a semicolon. This is just some syntax that you need to remember whenever you're coding with CSS. All right, so what identifies a class in CSS and what identifies an ID? So a class in CSS is identified with a period. So it's dot whatever class name you have, and then curly brackets and whatever code you want to execute inside. For an ID, it's the hashtag #, whatever you call it, followed by your ID name, followed by curly brackets, and inside those curly brackets, whatever code you want to include. And a good thing to note is that classes are used to identify multiple elements, and IDs are only for identifying one element. So if you're ever wondering like whether you should use a class and an ID for something, just remember this distinction. All right, final question. What is the background color given in this section of code? Assume that all A selectors are listed. So we have A background color yellow and A background color teal. And so the answer is teal, and we just went over CSS priority, but basically this is because the last A selector listed is the teal background color. So then because it's the last one listed, we execute this one, and it gives us a teal background color. All right, so now we're going to quickly dive into JavaScript. All right, so a brief history. It was created as LiveScript in 1995, which was then renamed to JavaScript. And it was standardized by the ECMA script specifications. We don't really need to know this to know how to code in JavaScript, but it's just something to note. JavaScript is a client-side processing language. This basically means that the browser reads the code and then executes it directly. JavaScript is obviously used with interfaces of HTML and CSS, which we've already learned in the first half of this semester and then also last semester. And then JavaScript is used to let you build dynamic web pages that respond to input from users. So basically JavaScript is basically used to make your website come alive with the functions embedded in it. And another fun fact is that JavaScript remains one of the most used languages today alongside Java, C++, and Python, which is really cool. All right, so what can JavaScript do? So JavaScript can do a lot of things. Some of them are listed here. We have fully featured web applications, image lightboxes, and interactive elements like tabs, sliders, etc. For the remainder of this semester, we'll mostly be looking at the last one, interactive elements. So this includes buttons, tabs, sliders, and you can see this in a variety of websites, even for example, like the school website, or whenever you go onto Google and search up maybe images or something, you'll always see elements like this that are being used in web pages globally. All right, and here's some more stuff. So JavaScript can also keep track of users with cookies or storing data with local storage. And it can also be used for drawing and animation. I think later this semester, we'll also look at drawing and animation in particular. And we'll also have some fun mini projects for you all to do. All right, so this is just a brief overview of the next meeting. So next meeting, we'll be looking specifically at the syntax for HTML buttons. This is basically, we'll be laying out the button with HTML, and then the function with the button is provided by JavaScript. And then here, we also listed the code for HTML and JavaScript for coding buttons. And there's a brief explanation at the bottom. It's okay if you don't understand the syntax right now, but it will be covered in our next lesson. And if you want to look ahead, here's just a brief overview. All right, that is it for this meeting. Thank you all for watching up to this point. Our next meeting will be released in 2 weeks' time on February 24th, and we'll be learning about JavaScript functions and HTML buttons.